Tonight we're going to be back into Psalms. We're going to be in Psalms 80. And when you think about the Psalms, we're going to see here tonight that this psalm, I think, is divided in maybe three sections, verses 1 through 3, 4 through 7, then 8, following the rest of the chapter. What I want to do is go through this psalm, and then hopefully we're going to have time because we've got a lot to say at the end, and maybe talk about the practical stuff and how maybe this applies to us and some things that will help us as we get to the end of this. Now, the book of Psalms, as we've seen over and over in our study, is far more than, it's a lot more than just a lot of individual psalms just kind of put together and slapped together by different authors and things of this nature. It's not like a radio station, you just get whatever song comes on there. I think the Psalms is more like a playlist, or back in my day when you're playing a record or a CD or a tape. You know, it's in order, it's in the order that they chose for it to be, and you get used to that. And as you get used to that, you start knowing what that theme of maybe that album is or whatever, of what they're trying to achieve. But also you get familiar with it and you know what to expect to come next, right? I think that's how the Psalms are, where it's intended to be placed like they are for a reason. We get different things out of them for a reason, and we need to, as it progresses, to know what to expect and what the author is trying to achieve through it. So I think that's what I'm getting anyway as we've been studying the Psalms together. Now, what I want to do is just as we dive into Psalms 80, we'll kind of break this down and talk through it as we go. But verses 1 through 3, he says, "Give ear," this is Asaph, he says, "Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who dwell between the cherubims, shine forth before Ephraim and Benjamin and Manasseh. Stir up your strength and come and save us. Restore us, O God, cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved." In these three verses, we see that we see first of all the start of Asaph's request, that God would act according to His promise and according to His character. I think Asaph knows who he's praying to, knows. And I think he's appealing to the promises that God has made, and he's appealing to the character of God. Because you've got to understand, I think it's hard to pinpoint. There's a lot of theories on when this psalm is actually written, what event, all the way from the captivity at Babylon to the northern kingdom leaving, that division of the kingdoms. I kind of think that's more maybe where it may be toward. But regardless, the psalmist is going through as we've studied before, a pretty tragic event, and he's appealing to God here. And I think it's noteworthy that he calls God here the shepherd of Israel. I think that's important because it's in a very central way of describing God throughout the Old Testament, but especially regarding the Exodus from Egypt. And this psalmist used this back in Psalm 78, but also Psalm 79. In Psalm 78, beginning at verse 51, if you remember, he said, "And destroyed all the firstborn in Egypt, the first of their strength in the tents of Ham. But he made his own people go forth like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. And he led them on safely so that they did not fear, but the sea overwhelmed their enemies." So if you remember, he was describing God as a shepherd leading their flock. And then at the end of Psalm 79, verse 13, he says, "So we, your people, and sheep of your pasture, will give you thanks forever. We will show forth your praise to all generations." So I think there's a reason here that the psalmist here begins to by referring to God as a shepherd leading its flock, caring for them, taking them out of a bad situation and bringing them to a good situation, bringing them where the pasture is, bringing them where the water is, caring for them, keeping the wolves out. So I think he's referring to God as a shepherd for a reason. I think it goes to the the character of God. I think that's what he's appealing to, the loving nature of God, of how he's caring for his people. But secondly, we see that in addition to him being a shepherd of Israel, we see when he talks about God being enthroned upon the cherub. Again, drawing an image, if you will, from Israel's early history right after Exodus, where, remember, the Lord commanded Moses, when it come to the Ark of the Covenant, what do you have him place on the outside there? You remember when he had the cherubims put there on the outside as representative of the angels that guarded the Garden of Eden. So he's going back, and I think it's interesting how this author looks back at certain points of history of how he's viewing God and what he's bringing back to the memory. It's almost like he's calling on God, you remember when you did this? I remember when you did. Either I read about this or someone taught me this, or even things that he's seen with his own eyes, talking about that loving nature of God and bringing these things back to, maybe he's thinking to God's memory, even though he doesn't forget things. But this imagery of God, I think it highlights both God's history with the nation of Israel, as well as his ability and his character. So I think the author is covering both things here. He's going back through history, recalling different events, but he's also appealing to, especially here, I think God's character. But notice here, we see that he makes a request of God. Asaph does here, that he would shine forth in verse 1, that his face would shine in verse 3. Why do you think he says it like this? Does this bring back anything? Notice what he says again in verse 1. Let's go back to verse 1. Give ear, O shepherd of Israel, who you lead, you who lead Joseph like a flock, you who dwell between the cherubims, shine forth before Ephraim, Benjamin, and Manasseh. Stir up your strength and come and save us. Restore us, O God. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. If you go to Numbers chapter 6, if you remember the Aaronic blessing, you remember in Numbers 6, and starting in verse 24. I know I didn't give you these ahead of time, Jonathan. I'm sorry. But starting in verse 24 of Numbers 6, the Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Now, I think this is a very important part, because this is a blessing that God is talking about the priest giving here. This is a good thing to do, but it seems here that Asaph is thinking that God has revoked that his face isn't shining upon them, that he's not shining forth. In other words, God has left them. He's revoked that privilege. He's revoked that blessing. So Asaph is looking, and if you'll notice as it goes through verse the Psalms here, as he goes through these verses, it's not so much about what's happening as it is about how the psalmist feels that this reflects upon God and what this means for them. That he's understanding God has separated himself here, is what he's feeling and seeing. Something has changed. And what he's in despair about is that the fact that it has changed, the reason that it has changed, and not only how that affects them, but how that affects those that are around. He's saying basically, what does God look like now to those that are around because this is happening? But he's realizing here that God's face is not shining upon them, and he's wanting his presence to return to them. Now let's go on to verse 4. As I said, we'll talk about some practical things toward the end. He says, O Lord God of hosts, how long will you be angry against the prayer of your people? You have fed them with the bread of tears, and given them tears to drink in great measure. You have made us a strife to our neighbors, and our enemies laugh among themselves. Restore us, O God of hosts. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. So notice as you're going through here the shepherd of Israel is now called the Lord God of hosts. So he's turned from this loving shepherd to now more of a military leader of the heavenly host, of armies, of how powerful God is. So he's talking about God's character. He's talking about God's promises, God's ability, but also His power and what He's able to do. So now He's referring to Him as the Lord of hosts, a title, again, that emphasizes His power. Now, taking these titles all together, I think it's pretty clear that Asaph knows exactly who he's praying to. I think he knows exactly, as much as he can, how powerful God is, what God's character is, what God's able to do. And I think this makes it even harder because he knows that if God's face isn't shining upon them, then there's a problem there. And first they've got to decide and realize, what is that problem? And how can we fix this? Because he says, if your face will shine back on us, then we could be saved. But if your face isn't shining on us, then there's not going to be any salvation there. So he knows that there's a problem. He knows that there's an issue. And when it comes to what to do about it, I think that's where the problem is. What is it that he's going to do? Now we see here, again, I don't think it's so much the problem itself or the situation itself. I think it's what the situation is saying about God. Because here's the thing. If you were in Asaph's position and you're realizing God is not shining His face upon you again, you realize that there's a problem. And if God's the problem, in other words, God is the one who's not shining their face, how are you going to fix that? What has to be done there? You know, that's a position to be in. It's, okay, we're serving this sovereign God. I've got to figure out what the problem is so God's face can shine back upon us again, because it's a problem if you don't. So I think that happens even today when we start realizing, and when I say God's the problem is that we have done something to separate us from God, as Isaiah 59, 1 and 2 says. Remember, it's not that God can't hear us. It's not that God can't reach us. It's that our sin has separated us from God. I think that's what Asaph is beginning to see here. And I think that's where he's coming to this realization. Okay, here's the problem. We're separated from God. And that's a pretty big problem. And I think he's trying to get through this to see what has to happen for them to get back right. Now, he asked a question here, and we may touch on it a little bit, but we'll go to it at the end. He says, how long will you be angry with your people's prayer? Now, this would be a pretty big problem, wouldn't it? Especially for the one lamenting here like he is. If God has a problem with you, with us as an individual or us as a nation, as Asaph is dealing with here, and He's even angry with your prayers, so does that affect how you communicate with Him? How are you going to fix the problem? You know, he says here, how long will you be angry with your people's prayers? And I think what we have to realize is, then there's a problem with the prayer, isn't there? There's a problem in why they're praying and how they're praying. And I think we're going to see that as we kind of go through this. But I think it's important to realize that Asaph is realizing that, okay, look at how the people are laughing. I think he's trying to, I'm trying to put it in the right words. He's looking at it from both sides. Okay, this is affecting us. This is the problem we're in, and the problem is that your face is not shining down upon us. And then as we get in and see some of the things that he says here, it becomes a problem with the nations around with how they're going to view God. That's what he's worried about. How are they going to view you? With this happening to us, your nation, how are they going to look at you? They're just going to laugh. And I think that's what Asaph is dealing with here. But again, we see a problem here that's going to be hard to get a solution to, but I think you also see hope. And that hope is in verse 7. Restore us, O God of hosts. Let your face shine upon us, that we may be saved. The hope is God's face has to shine upon them again for there to be salvation. They have to be in good standings with God for that to happen. So even in the middle of this problem, I think he's seeing some hope here. and what do we do with that hope, and how do we reach that hope. Now, they're seeing that the shepherd here is apparently turned against his flock with wrath and maybe even a little bit of disgust of why God allowed this to happen. And again, it depends on what event that you lay this to. If it was the event of the captivity of Babylon, they're wondering, why would you let your people go into this situation? If it's like others and most, which it very well could be, during the divided kingdom, and remember when Samaria was sacked, the capital was sacked, what was it, about 720 BC, right in there? If it was that event, either event to Asaph, whichever Asaph this is, it looks bad to the people around. How could God, this sovereign God, this one true God, Yahweh, that could let his people go into captivity or even allow it and not be able to stop it? Or how could he let his kingdom be divided like it is and just kind of almost come into nothing, as he's going to describe here? God, how can you let that happen? It's almost like, and I think I can start seeing why God was angry with their prayers, because if they're thinking a little bit like Asaph here is, hey God, this just looks bad on you. Why are you doing this? This makes you look bad. In other words, it's almost like he's trying to say, you need to fix this because you look bad in this, God. And I think that's what he's struggling with here. Let's begin in verse 8 now. It says, you have brought a vine out of Egypt. You have cast out the nations. You have planted it. You prepared room for it. You caused it to take deep root. It filled the land. The hills were covered with its shadows, the mighty cedars with its boughs. She sent out her boughs to the sea and her branches to the river. Why have you broken down her hedges so that all who pass by the way pluck her fruit? The boar out of the woods uproots it, and the wild beasts of the field devour it. Return, we beseech you, O God of hosts. Look down from heaven and see, and visit this vine, and the vineyard which your right hand has planted, and the branch that you made strong for yourself. It is burned with fire, it is cut down. They perish at the rebuke of your countenance. Let your hand be upon the man of your right hand, upon the Son of Man whom you made strong for yourself. Then we will not turn back from you. Revive us, and we will call upon your name. Restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. Now, there's a lot that he said here, but it comes down, I think, to this. Now it's describing Israel here as a vine. And he says, why would you take a little sapling? And just think, God has took a few people and making a nation out of them, right? And I think what the author is saying here, why would you take this little sapling and clear everything out around it so it could grow? Isn't that what he did? He brought them out of Egypt. He's taken them. He took them through all this. He's clearing out the land. He's warning them not to intermingle, not to do all this, because he's trying to protect this little sapling. And he's warning them of what will happen. So the author is saying, why would you do that and let it grow to this deep-rooted tree, and now let the boars and the creatures and everybody just come in and devour it? He's saying, God, why would you allow that to happen? Why would you let that? And he says, and then he gives a couple clues to some things here. One, a clue to what actually took place and taking some responsibility. He said, God, if you'll do this, then we won't rebel against you. We won't turn. So what he's indicating is the reason we're in this situation is that we've turned against you. We won't do that. Then he says, okay, here's how you do that, God. You take the one at your right hand, you put them over us. We won't return against you if you do this. Now, there's a lot of discussion throughout Bible scholars on exactly what he means here. Is he talking about the kings of the nations at this time? If you would just let the kings do this, we'll follow them, which in turn follow you. Or is he talking about the ultimate king, which is Christ? So believe it or not, there's a lot of discussion on that. My opinion on that is he's talking about both. One is, I think he is, in the immediate context, they're talking about the kings here. You know, here's what you do set up. And here's where you're getting into the problem with them, I think. And I think this is why God, after what we're reading from verse 8 on, why God is having a problem with their prayers. I think what they're praying and what they're saying, I think they're wanting peace. They're wanting prosperity. They're wanting God to give it to them, but don't be involved with it afterwards. Don't tell us what to do. Don't be. It's almost like they're using God as a grocery store, if you will. Okay, we're starving now. We're in the middle of this. Give me the food that I need. Give me the substance that I need. I'll pay for it now. We'll be square. Don't bother me again until I need you. I think that's what they've been using God for, and God doesn't like that. He doesn't want them to be like that. He is a sovereign God, and that's what makes Him different than. It's almost like Asaph is saying to Him, God, if you don't do it this way, what makes you any different than all the other gods that people worship? If your people can be beaten, if someone bigger and badder than you comes along and takes your people, then what kind of God? It's almost like that's what Asaph is saying. But as we see here, as it goes through this, what God has a problem with, He took this sapling, this vine, and as He cleared everything out around it, as He's letting it take root and grow, what's happened to it? It's producing poisonous fruit. And I think the reason it's producing poisonous fruit is because they didn't stay true like God told them to stay true. They rebelled, they intermingled, they started worshiping false gods. The next thing you know, that sapling that God is protecting. Now, it's not like God said, boy, this plan didn't work, let me go to plan B. God's always had this plan. He knows the beginning from the end and the end from the beginning. But notice in the process what the people are doing. And what we have to ask ourselves, here's where the practical part comes in. Are we any different today? Could this psalm be for us today, doing the same thing? Is God angry with us today? Have you ever looked around and seen things that go on out in the world, in our country, in our cities, in our towns, maybe even in our congregations, and think, how did we get to this point? What is it that God's trying to do? Is He angry with us and we're experiencing His wrath? Are we going through persecution and chastisement to help us? I mean, it's almost like we could pray and sing this psalm, couldn't we? Bill?
I was going to say, you look at the church as a whole today, there's a lot of changes going on in congregations across the country that should be going on. Instrumental music coming in, and women preachers and all this, it's been slipped in. And, like Psalms 81 talks about repentance.
Mm-hmm.
That's what they needed then, that's what we need now.
Yeah. You start seeing this, and I don't know about you, ever since we've been studying Psalms, I've been thinking about this the more we got into Psalms. And you think about, especially during the lament times of them crying out to God and what the problem is, and you start seeing what their problem was. And their problem was they didn't, first and foremost, didn't stay true to God. God warned them, but God allowed them to make these choices, didn't He? But now they're facing the consequences of those choices. Just like when they cried out and wanted a king. Remember? Was that 1 Samuel 8? 1 Samuel 8? When they talked about a king and God went through this list. Okay, but here's what the king's going to do. I tell you, it's almost comical to me to read that. Hey, they're going to do this. They're going to make you slaves. They're going to make you all this. And basically God said, don't come crying to me when it happens. I'm warning you that's going to happen. But He allows them to go down that road, don't He? Well, God here, remember when the psalmist keeps referring back to that and basically saying we need another rescue like Exodus. That's what that's what the psalmist is needing now. And what we're ultimately going to see is God ultimately provides that, doesn't He? He does that with Jesus, doesn't He? This great rescue out of the bondage of sin. So God is going to answer Asaph's prayer here of, okay, here's what we need to happen. We need you to set your right-hand person over us, we won't rebel against you, and to, basically this other rescue that we need, God's going to ultimately do that with His Son. But immediately, in this context, I think, of what Psalms 80 is, in that immediate context, you've got several different issues coming together at one time, and I think it's very similar to what we see today. You've got a nation that is not staying true to God over time, and then now you're seeing consequences of that. And now now we're at a point to say, okay, God, why are you doing this to us? Should we ask that question, why God's doing this to us? Or should we say, are we the one that did it to us? I think Asaph kind of was asking the wrong question here. He did ask the question, how long will you be angry with our prayers? And I think the answer to that is, until you start doing right and praying like you should. You can't, and I think what they're wanting, and I think we still want the same thing today. God, I need you to help us. I need you to provide for us. I just don't need you in the process of doing it. I tell you what I think we almost have become. We've become that generation that doesn't move out of the house, but don't want any instructions from parents. Does that make sense? I think that's what it's become. I think it's become where I want you to provide for me. I want you to feed me. I want you to help me. I don't want you to tell me what to do. I'm an adult. Don't tell me what to do. So, how do you navigate that situation? I think that's where they are right here. I know I'm not saying every person's like that, but I think there's that situation that exists. I'm an adult. I was like that when I turned 17. I was like, I'm an adult. Don't tell me what to do. You know what I got told? As long as you're in this house, I don't care if you're 40 years old, you're going to do what this house rules are. And then I find those words coming out of my mouth all the time, But I think that's where we're at. I want you to do this even in society, I want you to do everything for me, provide everything for me, except for telling me how to live my life and what to do. We can't have it both ways, can we? But I think that's exactly where they were in this point. They had rebelled against God. They didn't heed His warnings. I think they wanted to go back to the time where everybody did what was right in their own eyes, until it got to the point where they needed God. And remember, God would bring them somebody. They'd come back close for a while, and then they'd start doing like they wanted to anymore till they got into a situation they called on God. I think that's where we're at. That's what we want. And as he's praying this, what's the only thing that's going to happen? What's the only thing that's going to fix it is what he says in every refrain is, restore us, O Lord God of... Do you hear that, Titus? I used a musical term, refrain. There we go. Restore us, O Lord God of hosts. Cause your face to shine, and we shall be saved. Every one of these sections are broken up with this, because that's what it really comes back to, isn't it? Okay, here's where we got. Remember, we'll come back to you. We won't leave you again. Just shine your face upon us. Well, what happens when we kind of get right? Okay, we start doing what God wants us to do, but we have to keep doing that. We can't rebel against God and expect to still have the protection that God promised His people that they would have if they would follow Him.
We need to restore ourselves.
Exactly.
Depending on God to do everything for us.
Mm-hmm.
We've got the Word, what that He's spoken. Now we just follow His Word,
Mm-hmm.
follow His will. But it's easy to get slipped off.
Yeah. Yeah, everything we see, even from society, and I've always said this, and it's starting really, I've heard this ever since I was younger, and I've started thinking about it more, and I've started saying it is, the reason, whether in the church or whether in society as a whole, the reason we're at where we're at is because of 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago. If you want to see how society's going to be 10 years from now, look at the families now. You want to see what the congregation is going to be like? Look at the congregation now. Good, bad, or indifferent, I think that's the beginning of it. That's the process of it. Especially when Alan Webster was here, we was going through the spiritual meters and things like this. I've been thinking about this a lot. You know, what got, if our meter is not, our needle is not where it should be, we got to first ask ourselves, how did we get there? We can't just jump back on the track. I think we have to go back to where we got off and think, why did we get off? If we did. And how to get back on from there to get back right. And I think that's what they're seeing here. You know, and if you see even what God did with Jesus, I think it goes back to Psalms 80 here. Jesus took that wrath of God, didn't he? He took that wrath of sin for us. In that essence of He paid that debt that we couldn't pay. And to provide that way, that access for us to return to Him so His face could shine upon us. See, the problem is that goes back to holiness. It goes back to righteousness. What makes us holy? What makes us righteous? It's God. God can't be in the presence of unholiness, can He? He can't be in the presence of unrighteousness. So there's something that has to make us that way. And that way is through the blood of His Son. Jesus took that wrath for us, but we have to walk in that light to access it and to continue to access it. As Bill said, just go back to the Word, to stay straight with the Word. But I think in many instances, and I'm talking about society as a whole, and even sometimes within the church collectively, I don't think we want to do that. I don't think we want to go back, because when it comes to men being men and women being women, that's not what people want to hear today. When it comes to submissiveness, that's not what people want to hear today. When it comes to walk that narrow road, people don't want to hear anything about narrowness. You know, we want our version of it. We don't want what it actually is. And I think sometimes what it actually is may scare us a little bit. It may be different than what we're doing now. I think there's a lot of things that may go with that, and I think that's what happened with them. They got comfortable in that situation, that's become who they were, to where God said, well, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll just wipe that out. That's your central thing of religion, then I'll wipe that out and make you realize that's not what it's about. That's not what it was intended to, you know. And He talks about the vine here. Jesus talked about the vine. What was it? John 15? You know, of even producing fruit. We've got to produce that right fruit. He's planted that vine. There's nothing wrong with the seed, but when it grows up, it's got to be protected, and it's got to be up to us to do that. We can't pollute it with all these other things, so that vine becomes something, or the branches of it. The vine is true, but these branches that come off, God can cut them off. That's what He told. That's what John told him in John 3, didn't it? He said the axe is laid to the root, and He's about to cut it down. You can say you're children of Abraham all day long. That's not going to mean anything. That's not what makes you righteous. It's following what He says. So I can say, well, I've been doing this all my life, or my mom and daddy, or my grandparents. We can say that all we want, but does it really change anything of how I'm living? It takes each one of us to live the way that we should. Any thoughts or comments on this?
I just think as we read the Gospels, like Matthew through John, this psalm should be in our mind, because, like you said, how much language of this psalm picked up by Jesus and John the Baptist, and as he went around doing and I think about, you know, the kingdom is like a tree that spreads out, and its branches fill, you know, and I think as they went around preaching, this psalm would have been in the people's minds they were preaching to it. I mean, they would have sung this at synagogue and the temple time and time again. And so I think it's helpful for us to think about, again, Israel when Jesus came, they were hurt. They looked at the Roman influence around them and thought, well, it's pretty much over. We're pretty much done. Our place in the world's over unless God intervenes. And I think, like you said, Jesus becomes the answer then and now. We find ourselves in the same situation. And part of that answer is the road out of the tunnel is going to involve suffering at some time. Like you're saying here, Asaph, why are we suffering? Why are we suffering? You could say the same thing about Jesus. When God planted this branch in Jesus, why would He let Him die? Because the suffering is required to get to the other side. So I think this psalm is just...
I was thinking of your lesson Sunday night about types and typology, and when I was reading through this psalm of how, you know, you look at what God was doing with Israel about the suffering they were doing, and that's exactly what Jesus had to do. He had to take that suffering for us to get to that point. And I just don't know how much we're willing to do that at times. And I'm just speaking for myself. You know, what am I willing to do for to get to heaven? You know, am I willing to do it God's way, or am I going to modify God's way to suit? My wife and I was talking the other night, and I'm trying to develop a lesson on this, on how, and it was something that you said Sunday night. I think sometimes we take something that God says, and instead of trying to understand what He says and do that, I think sometimes we even do the opposite of it, because we're trying to bring God down to our level to make it what we want it to be, what we want what He says to do. And it may be something totally different than what God meant it to start with, because we try to put it down to how we want it to be. And I think there's and I got to studying that some, there's a lot more examples of that than I really realized there was, that God shows us what the results of doing that is, of trying to put God down on our level and in that box that we want Him to be in. So when you said this is what I want it to mean, so this is what I'm going to do.
That's why we have so many different denominations.
That's exactly right.
In our way, because what's the problem causes, because they want some of what God says and some of what they want. That's not right.
And many people take the vine and the branches to mean just that. It's the vine, but different denominations are the branches. And that can't even be. It's got to come from the same vine and produce the same fruit. You know, that's not even possible to do. To produce all different fruits, it's got to be the same fruit. And if it's not the fruit that He says to produce, then it's going to be cut down. Because you think about it, there's a lot of different reasons for that. And that's what was happening here as He talks about a vine. And that's what He was saying to God. Remember, He's saying, why would you do all this but allow the boars to just come and eat it up and the creatures to eat it up and just devour it? Why would you go through all this trouble, God, and just allow this to happen? That looks bad on you. I think that's what He's kind of almost implying there is, why would you do that? And really the reality is, God said, I took care of you. I brought you out. I cleared the way. I done everything necessary for you to grow and produce the fruit you need to do, and you poisoned it. You're the one that corrupted it. You're the one that did this. But notice, all these things had to happen. The division, the captivity, all these things had to happen. That was part of God's plan as He used the free will of man to bring Jesus in, that which is that ultimate rescue.
Similar concept to the Lord's Supper bread. A little leaven leavens the whole loaf.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. It sure does. I mean, think about it. You got something growing in the garden that looks diseased and looks all that. You're not just going to dig it up because it's not producing. You're going to dig it up so it don't corrupt the rest of your garden. It's taking up the nutrients of the garden for the good plants and the good vines. So that's why you'd want it to do. Any other thoughts or comments?
We want to put ourselves on the same level as God and make the decisions and the rules for our religion.
Mm-hmm.
Our life.
Yeah, because we do that in every area of our life, don't we? I think worship ought to be better. I mean, if I was in charge of worship, we'd do it a whole lot different than we do it. Lord's Supper would be different. I know that. They'd be cake and some milk on there or something. Yeah. And I think, quite honestly, all kidding aside, I think, speaking for myself, I think we do it sometimes and don't realize that we're doing it. And then we get into a place we didn't realize we got to, and we become comfortable with it. And all it takes is just a little here, a little movement here. That's why elderships are so important. That's why qualifications of elders are so important, because you have a congregation, and God set this up because God knew what He was doing. You do this because you don't only look at what's going on now, where could this lead? You want to stop things before they get in your garden. That's why you put up fences so deers can't get in, and you plant all the things. You do everything that you can do to keep your garden what it should be, and you try to anticipate what's going to happen. And I think that's why elderships are so important. Is you got to look 2 or 3 steps down the road. Okay, there may not be a wolf here, but this path we're on can lead to one, and we've got to be careful with that. And I think sometimes that can be, that's a hard position to be in sometimes. And I think we as a congregation need to always be aware of that. Any final thoughts? Yeah, that's exactly right. And I tell you, it takes a lot of, and I think we've seen this with ASAP, especially the last few. It takes a lot of soul searching and honesty to do that. It's hard to be honest with ourselves and say, I've got to take a look at myself and see, is this what I'm doing? Is this the reason that I'm in this situation that I'm in? And sometimes that's hard to do, to take a look like that.